In the last video, we dealt with those two Roman disasters, first in Africa, and then the relief fleet was sunk off the coast of Sicily. Now, any other city-state might have given up, but these were Romans after all, and they never once thought about suing for peace, and so the First Punic War continued on. And in short order, the Romans, of course, turned the situation right around. Now, the Romans decided to construct a new fleet of 220 ships, and amazingly, they were able to accomplish this in just a few months. Now, Rome's primary objective was the city of Lilybaeum. At this time, Lilybaeum was the most important Carthaginian city in western Sicily. A loss of this city would jeopardize all of the Carthaginian possessions in Sicily, and so it was the key lifeline to the rest of the Carthaginian cities in Sicily, and that is why the Romans were so intent on either capturing or destroying the city. But the initial Roman attack on Lilybaeum was repulsed, and the Romans were forced to retreat. Now later in 253 BC, the Romans launched a raid against Africa, and while the raid was successful, on the return trip, yet another storm wiped out 150 ships off the coast of Sicily. After this, the Romans decided to concentrate on land operations. And so weather was clearly not on the side of the Romans during this war. In fact, weather did more damage to the Roman galleys than the Carthaginians. Now on land in northern Sicily, the Romans made much better progress. The city of Thermae was captured by siege in 252 BC. 1 year later, the cities of Kephlodon and Panormus also fell in 251 BC. So with the fall of these cities, the Carthaginians only held a small portion of western Sicily. And with that, the Romans decided to make one final push to capture the rest of Sicily. And so let's go ahead and update the map here so you can get an idea of the general situation. And if you take a look at that, you can see Sicily is being consumed by Roman purple. And the Carthaginians were just barely holding on to the western side of the island. Now, Rome decided to take another crack at Lilybaeum, and the Roman Senate appropriated 200 ships and over 100,000 soldiers for this monumental task. The Navy would blockade the harbor at Lilybaeum. In fact, they were right at the mouth of the harbor. While on land, the Romans would construct several siege towers to assault the walls of the city. The Carthaginians were desperate to save their most important city in Sicily, and so they sent several ships to bust through the Roman naval blockade. These blockade runners were successful in not only leaving the city, but also arriving at Lilybaeum, and so this greatly frustrated the Romans, who wanted to starve out the city. And so the Romans decided to up the ante. According to Polybius, they began to dump rubble to try to fill in the harbor, but their efforts apparently failed because the water was simply too deep there. But apparently the Romans did manage to create a bank at one spot, and so a couple Carthaginian ships ran aground at that spot. Now on land, the Carthaginians decided to launch a surprise attack against the Roman siege towers, and they attacked these siege engines with fire. Fire was very useful because most of the siege engines in those days were built out of timber. And apparently a strong wind aided the Carthaginians and blew the flames right onto the towers. And so the fire took hold quickly, and almost all of the Roman siege towers were destroyed. After this setback, the Romans gave up on siege towers and simply decided to surround the city with a trench and palisade. But this incident greatly improved the morale of the Carthaginians, while at the same time demoralized the Romans. When news of this reached Rome, the Roman Senate decided to send reinforcements of about 10,000 soldiers. Now, the Roman consul Publius Claudius Pulcher grew tired of the stalemate at Lilybaeum, and so he decided to launch an all-out offensive against Drepana, and that was a Carthaginian city that was just to the north of Lilybaeum. And the hope was that if the Romans could take Drepana, that would put immense pressure on the Carthaginians at Lilybaeum, and that would force an immediate surrender. And so in the middle of the night, the Roman navy set out in close order down the coastline towards Drepana. The Carthaginians, however, spotted the Roman vessels, and the Carthaginian navy quickly put out to sea to avoid being trapped in the harbor. The Carthaginians then executed this amazing end-around, and suddenly they were outflanking the Roman ships who were attacking Drepana. The Romans attempted to reform their lines but failed, and many Roman ships were driven right into the shoreline. The Romans lost 93 ships. ships that were either captured or destroyed. This was the first great victory at sea for the Carthaginians that didn't involve a devastating storm. And so this was yet another loss for the Romans at sea. This forced the Romans, at least for the short term, to concentrate on land yet again. The Roman consul Claudius was blamed for the disaster at Drepana, but he was not killed. He was, however, exiled. And what did that mean? That meant you were denied food, water, and shelter for a distance of over 100 miles from all directions from Rome. And if they were able to survive this, they usually were able to retire to one of their numerous estates. Now, despite this current setback, the Romans were still determined to win the First Punic War. And so again, there was no talk of peace in Rome. Now, despite the fact that Carthage defeated the Romans at Drepana, they were still under siege by land at Lilybaeum. And so the Carthaginians tried desperately to break that siege at Lilybaeum. And so they launched several counterattacks against the Roman legions there. Despite all of this, the battered Roman legions held on and the siege continued. Now, in 248 BC, the Romans decided to assemble yet another naval force, and again, their fleet was wiped out by another storm. How many more storms were going to destroy Roman fleets? Now, in 247 BC, the famed Carthaginian general Hamilcar Barca was dispatched to Sicily, and he became the commanding general of all the Carthaginian forces in Sicily. And of course, as we know, he was the father of Hannibal Barca, who, by the way, was born in the same year that Hamilcar was dispatched to Sicily. Now, Hamilcar decided to make his base of operations near Panorma, and his base was fortified on top of a mountain, and this apparently was flanked by unclimbable cliffs. And so there were only a few approaches to this steep mountain, and so it was practically impossible for the Romans to dislodge Hamilcar out of his base. And so for almost 3 years, Hamilcar fought the Romans. This campaign is not well described, but according to Polybius, Hamilcar used guerrilla warfare tactics to keep the Roman legions off balance. And he was able to win several minor victories, but he failed to secure a decisive victory. Eventually, he was forced to establish a base closer to Carthaginian territory. Now, what Hamilcar really needed was more supplies and a stronger navy. But in 244 BC, a new faction gained power in Carthage, and that was led by the landowning aristocrat Hanno the Great, and he wanted to end the war with Rome and concentrate on expanding the Carthaginian Empire in Africa. And so it's important to note at this point, Carthage ruled the seas around Sicily, because at this time, Rome was unwilling to finance yet another expensive fleet. And so you might have thought that Carthage would have taken advantage of this and built more ships to prevent the Romans from ever again challenging them at sea. But Hanno's new plan instead was absolutely lunatic. He wanted to demobilize the Carthaginian Sicilian fleet and again concentrate on Africa. And so this greatly relieved the pressure off the Romans and gave the Romans a chance again to attain naval superiority. And so, as I said, the plan made absolutely no sense. And this was a continual problem for the Carthaginians. Carthage was a house divided. There was a peace faction and there was a war faction. And the peace faction was constantly undermining the war faction. And we would see that again in the Second Punic War as well. And so you have to wonder, had the Carthaginians been unified in the same way that the Romans were, things might have turned out very differently. I mean, can you imagine a Roman senator proposing that the Romans abandon Sicily? I think he would have been exiled very quickly. In any event, the Romans decided to take advantage of the changed situation in Carthage and decided to yet again build another fleet. But there was a problem. The Roman treasury was, for all intents and purposes, depleted from this very expensive war. And so private citizens needed to donate money to build a new fleet. Can you imagine today the United States asking for more money from its citizens to build a new navy? Well, Roman citizens had no problem doing this, and they heeded the call of the Roman Senate and donated the needed funds to build their new navy. And so the stage was set for one last decisive naval battle. Now, before that battle took place, the Roman consul Gaius Catulus was placed in charge of the Roman fleet, and he oversaw the training of the new Roman crews for these 200 ships. He also made sure the Roman ships were now more resistant to adverse weather conditions. And so with his new highly trained fleet, he set sail for Lilybaeum to set up a naval blockade. Now, Carthage decided to get serious about their navy again in the Mediterranean, and they decided to answer this new challenge by Rome with about 250 warships. And they made way for the Aegates Islands in 241 BC to relieve the Roman blockade at Lilybaeum. When the Romans received news of the Carthaginian fleet at the Aegates Islands, they decided to break off their naval blockade at Lilybaeum and head directly toward the Carthaginian positions. Now, as I mentioned, the Romans were able to spend a lot of time training their new crews, and so they were well supplied with equipment and provisions. The Carthaginian crews, on the other hand, were put together very quickly, and so they were relatively inexperienced. And that, again, was a result of the demobilization of the fleet a few years earlier. And so this time the Romans had the upper hand in terms of experience. And so in the ensuing battle, the Romans were able to ram several Carthaginian vessels, and about half of the Carthaginian fleet was either sunk or captured. And so Rome achieved a decisive victory over the Carthaginian fleet, a victory for which both Roman consuls were given a triumph. After this, Hamilcar was now cut off from Africa. As a result, he had no choice but to surrender. He was, however, able to gain a key concession, and that was his forces were allowed safe passage back to Africa. And so the First Punic War finally came to an end. 23 years of brutal fighting. But the Carthaginians and Romans still had to come to terms. Now, the first round of negotiations had the Carthaginians paying the Romans a fine of 2,200 talents over a period of 20 years. But when that draft made it back to Rome itself, the Roman people and Senate refused to accept that. And they decided to alter the basic framework a little bit. Now the amount was increased by 1,000 talents, and that gives us a total of 3,200 talents over a 10-year period. And so the time period was halved as well. Instead of paying this over a 20-year period, now it was due in 10 years. In addition, 1,000 talents were due immediately. Carthage also was forced to abandon Sicily and several other small islands between Sicily and Africa. Carthage also agreed not to hire any mercenaries from Italy or Sicily. Also, Roman prisoners had to be released without ransom. No such condition was provided for Carthaginian prisoners of war. And so Carthage had to pay massive ransoms to retrieve many of their prisoners of war. We will never know exactly how many casualties were suffered during the First Punic War, but they must have been in the tens of thousands, perhaps even higher. But Polybius does give us the amount of ships that were lost. Carthage lost 500 ships, and Rome lost around 700 ships. And of course, this does not include all of the siege equipment and cities that were absolutely leveled. So if we take a look at the overall picture, this was the first struggle, of course, between these two great rivals on the Mediterranean. And in the beginning, Carthage had the greater wealth and the greater navy. But after the First Punic War, Rome was now one of the great powers in the world and had the strongest navy in the Western Mediterranean. So this first problem was finally resolved, but it wouldn't be too much longer before a new kind of problem started. And that, of course, was the Second Punic War. And we'll get to that in the next video.